The road into the settlement had softened after several days of steady rain. Cart wheels pressed narrow grooves into the mud, and water gathered there without moving. A wooden barrier lay open to one side, its hinge bent in a way that suggested it had not been repaired for some time. Beyond it stood a row of temporary buildings assembled from mismatched boards, and roofing felt darkened by moisture. Smoke rose slowly from a metal chimney, flattening as it met the low cloud. Nothing in the scene indicated urgency, only duration. Inside one of the rooms, a table had been placed near a window to catch the remaining daylight. Papers rested in small, ordered stacks held down by a chipped ceramic cup. A coat hung from the back of a chair, still damp along the hem. Someone had removed their gloves and set them beside an ink bottle that had begun to clot in the cold. The space carried the quiet of administration rather than habitation, work continuing after the purpose of the work had already begun to fade. In the months following Germany's surrender, attention settled unevenly across the defeated landscape. Certain figures were pursued immediately through arrest and trial. Others disappeared into rumor or conflicting reports. Around them remained families whose lives had depended on rank, proximity, and protection that no longer existed. Among these were the wives of senior officials, women who had lived within guarded compounds, traveled with privilege, and managed households sustained by systems now under investigation. Their transition into post-war life did not occur in a single moment. It unfolded through procedures: registration, questioning, relocation, waiting. Authorities required forms to be completed in careful handwriting. Addresses had to be verified. Possessions were listed, evaluated, sometimes confiscated. The language of power gave way to the language of paperwork. Many of these women entered temporary housing similar to the settlement. Beyond the muddy road, rooms were shared. Furniture was borrowed or improvised. Windows admitted drafts that coal shortages made difficult to resist. Daily concerns narrowed toward food rations, heating fuel, and the placement of children in overcrowded schools. The scale of previous life, large residences, staff, controlled access, contracted into measurements of bread and hours of warmth. Interrogations formed part of this adjustment. They were rarely dramatic. Officials asked structured questions in neutral tones. Dates of marriage, knowledge of employment, awareness of camps or forced labor, financial accounts, correspondence received during the final months. Answers were written down without visible reaction. What mattered was consistency. Certainty was less important than alignment with earlier statements. Some wives claimed limited knowledge of their husband's activities. Domestic responsibility, they explained, had defined their sphere. Others acknowledged fragments, travel, rumors, unusual secrecy, without connecting them to wider crimes. Investigators recorded these distinctions carefully, aware that law required provable involvement rather than moral proximity. Files accumulated with testimony that neither fully condemned nor entirely cleared. Public perception developed along a different path. Newspapers and conversations sought recognizable figures of blame. The image of the privileged household, maintained while war consumed surrounding populations, carried symbolic weight even when legal responsibility remained uncertain. This tension between legal judgment and social memory shaped the years that followed. Children complicated the situation further. They required schooling, medical care, routine. Yet their surnames sometimes drew attention in classrooms where teachers themselves were undergoing review. Some families altered names or moved towns to reduce recognition. Others remained, trusting time to soften association. Adaptation. Adaptation rarely followed a single pattern. Economic survival proved decisive. Without access to former networks, many wives sought modest employment, clerical work, sewing, translation, assistance through church organizations. Wages were small and inconsistent. Travel permits restricted movement between regions. Winter returned each year as a practical test rather than a metaphor, measuring endurance through coal allotments and repaired clothing. Denazification proceedings introduced another layer of uncertainty. Classification systems divided individuals into categories ranging from major offenders to exonerated followers. Outcomes depended on documentation, testimony, and shifting political priorities as occupation policies evolved. For wives whose involvement had been indirect yet materially privileged, results varied widely. Some faced restrictions on employment or residence. Others received lighter judgments that allowed gradual reintegration. These processes rarely produced emotional resolution. Courtrooms emphasized order and procedure. Translation slowed speech into measured segments. Judges focused on evidence rather than narrative. The women standing before them often appeared ordinary, tired, formally dressed in worn clothing, responding briefly when addressed. Nothing in the setting resembled the authority once surrounding their lives. Outside legal structures, memory continued differently. Survivors of camps and forced labor carried experiences that resisted bureaucratic language. For them, the households of officials symbolized distance from suffering that had been immediate and physical. Encounters in postwar towns, at markets, in offices, along streets, could reopen divisions that official classifications attempted to close. Silence frequently replaced confrontation, but silence did not remove awareness. As the late 1940s turned into the early 1950s, administrative attention across West Germany shifted toward reconstruction. Infrastructure required rebuilding. Currency reform altered daily exchange. Political structures stabilized gradually. Within this broader movement, many families connected to the former regime were absorbed into ordinary civic life, not through forgiveness or forgetting, but through competing necessities that demanded forward motion. Legal declarations of death for missing husbands allowed property questions to conclude and pensions to begin, though often modestly. Such paperwork created practical endings where emotional ones remained uncertain. Widowhood without confirmed narrative became a common condition among these women, binding private memory to public ambiguity. Social reintegration unfolded unevenly. Some remarried, entering families without direct wartime association. Others remained alone, maintaining small domestic routines shaped by scarcity learned in the immediate post-war years. Community acceptance depended less on past rank than on present conduct, reliability, discretion, visible participation in rebuilding. Time functioned as a slow mediator rather than a clear judge. During the 1960s, renewed trials and generational change reopened discussion of wartime responsibility. Younger Germans asked questions more directly than their parents had. For the widows of prominent figures, this period could disturb routines long stabilized by silence. Public attention briefly returned to names once familiar, then moved on again as broader historical analysis replaced individual focus. Historians increasingly examined structures rather than personalities. Administrative systems, economic networks, and bureaucratic language became central to understanding how violence had been organized and sustained. Within this framework, the wives of elite officials appeared less as isolated figures and more as participants in environments shaped by privilege and distance. Their stories illustrated continuity between domestic order and political power without. Always revealing intention. Personal memory, however, rarely followed academic structure. Within families, photographs remained in drawers. Letters were preserved despite uncertain meaning. Questions were sometimes postponed rather than answered. Children who had grown into adults navigated identities shaped partly by events they had not chosen. Conversation moved cautiously around subjects that resisted simple explanation. By the later decades of the 20th century, the intensity surrounding many wartime associations diminished. Urban development altered landscapes once marked by destruction. Archives replaced living testimony as primary sources of knowledge. Public discourse shifted toward commemoration and education rather than immediate accusation. Within this distance, the lives of these women appeared less visible, though not entirely forgotten. Their experiences did not resolve into a single narrative. Some expressed regret in private writings. Others maintained distance from political responsibility. Many left little record beyond administrative documents, marriage certificates, residence permits, employment forms. History preserved their outlines more clearly than their thoughts. What connects these varied paths is the gradual movement from protected privilege to ordinary uncertainty. The transformation occurred without spectacle. No single moment marked its completion. Instead, years accumulated through routine. Shopping for food, repairing clothing, caring for children, aging. The scale of earlier power receded into memory measured against practical survival. In quiet settlements rebuilt from rubble, neighbors sometimes recalled which families had once lived differently. Such recollections surfaced briefly, then dissolved into present concerns. Reconstruction required cooperation that resentment complicated. Coexistence did not imply reconciliation, yet daily life proceeded through shared necessity. For historians, the significance of these women lies less in individual biography than in the broader pattern they represent. Their lives demonstrate how proximity to authority can persist beyond the authority itself, shaping memory, judgment, and identity across decades. They also reveal the limits of legal process in addressing moral distance, how documentation can conclude cases without concluding understanding. The landscapes where many of them spent their later years gradually lost visible traces of war. Trees grew where temporary structures had stood. Roads carried ordinary traffic. Children played in spaces once governed by restriction. Nothing in these scenes explained the histories beneath them unless someone chose to speak. Old age introduced another form of quiet. Public attention had long since moved elsewhere. Documents remained in archives rarely visited. Those who remembered firsthand grew fewer each year. Silence deepened not as concealment, but as the ordinary result of time. Yet absence does not equal erasure. The administrative papers, testimonies, and scattered personal records continue to outline lives lived in the shadow of extraordinary violence. They show how ordinary routines, marriage, household management, social visits, could exist beside systems of destruction without visibly intersecting. Understanding this coexistence remains difficult precisely because it lacks dramatic clarity. The end of these stories offers little resolution. There is no single reckoning equal to the scale of suffering that defined the era. Instead, there is continuation. Years lived quietly after history's attention moved away. Such continuation may be the most accurate conclusion available. On certain evenings, in towns rebuilt long after the war, windows reflect only present light. Inside, rooms contain the ordinary objects of daily life: tables, cups, folded clothing. Nothing announces the past. Only memory, carried privately and unevenly, suggests that earlier lives once moved. Within structures now gone, the rain that softens the road outside the settlement eventually stops. Mud dries, will marks fade. Travel resumes without trace of those who passed before. History remains, but not always where it can be easily seen.